In 1915, Detroit was not just a city. It was an experiment, an industrial gamble that would reshape labor, wealth, migration, and modern life itself. What began as a struggling manufacturing town was about to become the blueprint for the modern working world. But its rise would also plant the seeds of a future collapse no one saw coming. By the early 1910s, Detroit was a city in transition, but not yet a titan. Its population had crossed 465,000 by 1910, swollen by waves of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and by rural Americans searching for factory wages. Along the Detroit River, freight docks moved timber, iron, coal, and machinery into a dense web of rail yards and workshops. Carriage builders, stove manufacturers, and metalworking firms lined neighborhoods like Corktown and Black Bottom. Yet, Detroit still lacked the financial dominance of New York or the industrial diversity of Chicago. Housing shortages forced families into overcrowded tenements, while labor unrest simmered beneath the surface. The city had infrastructure, manpower, and location, but not yet a unifying engine powerful enough to define its future. That defining force was about to arrive. By 1910, Henry Ford had already failed twice in business, but his third company, the Ford Motor Company, was quietly rewriting industrial logic. Ford rejected the idea that automobiles were luxury items. He envisioned a machine that could be built cheaply, repaired easily, and sold to ordinary wage earners. In 1913, at his Highland Park plant, Ford introduced the world's first moving automobile assembly line, reducing the time required to build a Model T from over 12 hours to less than 2. The system demanded strict repetition, standardized parts, and rigid discipline. Productivity soared, but worker turnover exploded, exposing the human limits of mechanized labor and forcing Ford toward an unprecedented solution. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford announced a policy that stunned industrial America. Most factory workers would receive a minimum wage of $5 per day, more than double the prevailing industrial rate. The decision was not purely philanthropic. Ford faced severe labor shortages, absenteeism, and constant worker turnover caused by the exhausting pace of assembly line labor. The wage increase stabilized his workforce, reduced training costs, and dramatically increased productivity. The policy also came with strict behavioral conditions enforced by Ford's sociological department, which monitored workers' home lives, spending habits, and moral conduct. Thousands of men migrated to Detroit seeking these wages, triggering a population surge that reshaped the city's demographics and labor market. As Ford's production expanded after 1914, Detroit began reorganizing itself around factory life. New streetcar lines extended into industrial corridors connecting Highland Park, River Rouge, and Hamtramck. Entire residential districts were developed within walking distance of plants, creating tightly packed working-class neighborhoods. Shift whistles regulated daily life, determining when streets filled, schools dismissed, and shops opened. Small businesses adapted their hours to factory schedules, while churches organized services around rotating shifts. Housing construction accelerated, but demand outpaced supply, deepening overcrowding. Detroit was no longer merely hosting factories. It was physically restructuring its streets, transit, and neighborhoods around continuous industrial production, becoming a city synchronized to mechanical time rather than traditional civic rhythms. Between 1910 and 1920, Detroit's population increased by more than 100,000 people, driven by unprecedented migration flows. Southern black families arrived seeking escape from Jim Crow segregation and agricultural poverty, while immigrants from Poland, Italy, and the Balkans filled factory hiring lines. Neighborhoods such as Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, and Poletown expanded rapidly, becoming dense cultural enclaves defined by churches, social halls, and ethnic businesses. Industrial wages promised stability, but housing shortages forced many into overcrowded boarding houses. Racial discrimination restricted residential mobility, shaping segregated settlement patterns that would later deepen social divisions. Detroit's transformation into a multi-ethnic industrial metropolis had begun, altering its cultural fabric and labor identity. By the late 1910s, Detroit had become a focal point of industrial wealth creation. Ford, the Dodge brothers, and executives of Packard and Studebaker accumulated enormous fortunes, while factory wages elevated thousands of laborers into a new industrial middle class. Home ownership expanded, consumer purchasing increased, and installment buying became common. At the same time, labor organizations such as the American Federation of Labor began to organize auto workers, though employers aggressively resisted unionization. Company surveillance, blacklisting, and strike suppression maintained managerial control. Detroit was quietly constructing a modern class hierarchy, one rooted in industrial productivity, corporate power, and the growing distance between ownership and labor. By the end of the 1910s, Detroit had become the global reference point for industrial efficiency. Ford's Highland Park methods were studied by European manufacturers, including firms in Britain, Germany, and France. The principles of standardized parts, synchronized production lines, and wage stabilization spread internationally under what became known as Fordism. Governments and corporations adapted these systems to shipbuilding, munitions, and heavy manufacturing during the First World War. The logic of time-motion management shaped factory layouts, labor policies, and the emerging concept of standardized working hours. Detroit's industrial framework had moved beyond automobiles, becoming the organizational model for 20th-century mass production economies. Worldwide. By 1920, Detroit's industrial success had created deep structural dependencies. The city's economy became heavily concentrated around automobile manufacturing, limiting diversification. Rapid population growth strained housing, sanitation, and public services. Racially restrictive housing policies hardened segregation, embedding geographic inequality into the urban landscape. Labor relations grew increasingly adversarial, setting the stage for major industrial conflicts in the decades ahead. While production numbers continued to rise, Detroit's long-term stability rested on a narrow industrial base vulnerable to market shifts, automation, and global competition. The mechanisms that had fueled Detroit's explosive rise also introduced vulnerabilities that would later define its prolonged economic and social decline.